Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at das alte Jahr, vergangen ist, which translates to the old year now hath passed away. This is a very fascinating chorale. You're probably ahead of me here, but you're looking at like this extended chromatic passage here, the fact that it ends on a non-authentic cadence. All in all, if you've listened to this chorale, it has a very unique harmonic profile without being too modal. I think all in all what's happening here is a lot of kind of fringe uses of the melodic minor scale and harmonizing it and the effects that has on the harmony. We hear a lot of angular tensions where we don't typically expect them. And actually, before I get too far ahead of myself, I kind of just want the chorale to speak for itself as I analyze it, but this E flat is supposed to be a D sharp. It had me confused for a little bit, but let's just start off with the analysis. So no key signature. We start on A major and we end on E major, so it's a toss-up here. I think the overall tonality of the chorale is A minor. We spend the majority of our time in D minor, and there's the realm of one flat, so there may be some key signature disagreement going on here. All in all, I think we start off in the key of D minor. First phrase, there's really not much room to argue here with the B flat, and the C sharps. B flats rather. There are several of them and several C sharps. So starting things off, we start off with A major, which is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass. Then we have F, D, F and A, that's our tonic triad, D minor in first inversion, passing 7th in the alto. This D is a chord tone. And then we have G, B flat, E and G, that's E diminished over G, which is 2/6. This G is a chord tone, this D is a passing 7th, this F is a passing tone as well, and then that takes us to G, A, C sharp, and E, which is A7 over G. It's 5/4/2, and when we see a 4/2 chord, we typically know where it's going to resolve. The bass doesn't immediately resolve, but this E is a chord tone, we don't need to mark it. It's this F here, that's the actual trajectory of the resolution. We expect it to go to, in this case, D minor in first inversion, but a triad, or it doesn't even really need to be a triad, but a chord in first inversion whose root is a 5th below the 7 chords. So in this case, 1 is a 5th below 5. F, A, D, and A, 1/6. That's exactly where we would expect it to resolve. And then we go to D minor in root position very briefly, D, F, D, and A. As we're closing in on our first cadence, which is an imperfect authentic cadence, we have B flat, D, D, and G. That's G minor over B flat, which is 4/6. This G is a chord tone, this B flat is a chord tone, and this E is a neighbor tone here. And technically speaking, 3 voices are moving off of the harmonic rhythm, but only one voice is really changing, right? Because we already have a G, we already have or had a B flat, it's just being reiterated in another voice. This E really feels more like a neighbor tone to me, but if you're being more of a literalist, technically speaking, this is a 2/6 chord, 4 going to 2, not a very strong progression. They both function the same way. They're very similar in terms of their pitch content, and they both would be likely candidates to find in a cadential situation, but regardless, whatever's happening in this figure takes us to 5. A, D, and E, this D being accented non-chord tone, kind of like a 4/3 suspension over the bass. This C sharp is our actual chord tone, making this an A major chord. And then we cadence on D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad. Moving ahead to our next phrase, we have another imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. And there is an argument to be made here that we stay in the key of D minor for the entirety of the phrase, but to me, it really sounds like the majority of this phrase is spent in the key of F major. All in all, it's entirely up to you. I think there is a mid-phrase modulation going on here. It definitely is like one of the lesser, more interesting things about this chorale, but that's the way that I hear it. So if you analyze this entirely in D minor, totally valid. I analyze the first part of the phrase in F major and then loop back around to D minor. That's just what it sounds like to me. I think they're both accurate analyses. So we start off with D minor again, D, F, D, and A, passing 7th in the bass. We don't need to reanalyze because it's the same chord as the previous beat. And then we have B flat, F, D, and A. This really beautiful chord here where the bass changes, but we keep a D minor triad in the upper 3 voices. This is a B flat major 7 chord, and I'm marking this at as the point where we modulate to the key of F major. B flat major 7 also happens to be our 4 chord, and in the key of F, this D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get our first little hint at chromaticism in the bass here. We know that with chromatic bass lines, when they're just half-step motion in the same direction, up or down, we get some interesting harmonic progressions. Here we get a G major chord on first inversion, B, G, D, and G. That's going to be 5, 6 of 5 because G is the dominant of C, and C is our dominant in the key of F. We have a passing 7th in the melody here before we get C, G, D, and E, this D being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. This E is a chord tone, this C is a chord tone, so we know that this is just good old C major, which is our 5 chord in the key of F. And we would expect this to resolve to some type of tonic triad, which it does, C, F, C, and A. And I'm going to mark this as a 1-6-4 chord because it does seem significant that the bass is holding this C for 2.5 beats. All in all, what matters is that it's resolving to a tonic triad, not what inversion it's in, but the C being held as this brief sort of pedal on the bass seems significant to me. This A and this F are both chord tones as well, so we don't need to mark them. Then we have C, C, F, and G, and where I do think you could analyze this as a 5 chord, I think actually what's happening here is that this C resolves up. It's actually not really a resolution that's happening. It's, how would I describe what's happening here? Really, it's the C sharp that's going up to D here. If I was thinking about like a linear trajectory, like C, C sharp, D, kind of, sorta. But I think this C is an accented non-chord tone. This C and this F are all accented non-chord tones. It's kind of like there's a 4/3 suspension going on over the bass here, but the bass changes to match what's going on in the alto. And this is a really interesting thing that happens, in my opinion. Of course, take it with a grain of salt. It is in a contrapuntal situation, but I think it's a little too coincidental for it to just fly under the radar. We have an E diminished chord in root position, E, B flat, E, and G. And of course, this could be just a 5/7 chord, right? This could just be a big 5/7 chord. I could be making a big deal out of nothing. But we have E, B flat, E, and G. That's an E diminished chord, but something you might have already noticed is the fact that we have 2 leading tones, right? We're still in the key of F major here in the way that I analyze, which is kind of interesting, doubling the leading tone. That's typically a convention that harmony students are taught to avoid, or I guess the way that I would frame it is that it's typically something that isn't stylistic of composers of the time period. Write however you want. It's just something that is or was typically avoided. But of course, with the grain of salt being taken here, this diminished chord, this leading tone diminished chord, is in my opinion being recontextualized as 2 in root position in the key of D minor. So sorry that I ran out of space there, but yeah, 7 and 2 being flipped around here in terms of what this chord is functioning as. And it makes sense because we're going to be going to some type of A major chord here. C sharp, D, E, and E, or sorry, C sharp, B flat, E, and E. We have some C sharp fully diminished 7th vibes here, but this B flat is an accented non-chord tone, and it's actually the chord that we get on the next beat. That is our chord, in my opinion, A, C sharp, and E, which I think is further strengthening my argument here, because if we're looking at these 2 beats as counterparts to one another, if we're getting the realized chord on the end of the beat here, chances are we're getting the realized chord on the end of this beat here, and it's just a harmonic, or sorry, a cadential device that Bach is employing here. So this double leading tone 7 chord, definitely unusual. Of course, it's not like it's happening on the downbeat, complete, just no embellishment. It's just standing there, or just sitting there on the page. It's happening in a contrapuntal context. The doubled leading tone happens very frequent, in a very fleeting fashion. That's the word I was looking for. You could even make the argument that the D is as much a chord tone as the E is, because they're both 16th notes. All in all, it's not a tremendous deal. I just think it's kind of interesting that it happens that way. But this D is also a non-chord tone, now that I say that. But we cadence on D minor, D, A, D, and F. Tonic triad, root position. Alright, so going into our next phrase, we are going to have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor. And I think we modulate to A minor somewhere in this vicinity. All in all, very interesting phrase because of the chromaticism in the bass. We start off with a D minor chord, D, D, F, and A, so we don't need to reanalyze. Then we have G sharp, D, F, and B. What chord is this, and what is it doing here? Well, the G sharp fully diminished 7th chord is in root position, so we know it's a 7-7 chord of some type, but it's going to be 7-7 of 5 because G sharp is the leading tone to A, and this E is also a non-chord tone, but for shadowing where we're going to go next, G, A, E, and C sharp is A7 over G, which is our 5 chord and 3rd inversion, so we do have 7-7 going to 5-4-2. And then this is a very interesting chord here. We have F sharp, A, D, and D. Now, I think this is just some clear mode mixture going on, and also using the word foreshadowing again, it's foreshadowing or signaling what's going to be happening at the end of the phrase. At least that's from an analytical standpoint how I view what's happening here, with the idea of symmetry happening within the phrase. So this is a D major chord in 1st inversion, and where I would typically analyze this as 5-6 of 4, it does not resolve to a 4 chord. This really feels just like a 1-6 chord, literally a major tonic in the middle of the phrase. That's how it feels like it's functioning to me, and in the grand scheme of things, it's sort of like I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, it's signaling what's going to be happening next. So we have this major tonic in the middle of the phrase here, a little neighbor tone here that brings some attention to A here. In fact, I think there's an argument to be made that the modulation starts here, and this is also a 4 chord in the key of A minor. It just doesn't quite feel that way to me in terms of where it resolves. The modulation really feels like it happens on the next beat to me, F, A, C, and A, which is F major in the key of D minor. That is a 3 chord. Definitely interesting with the cross relations going on, of course. Well, actually, no, this isn't a cross relation, right, because it's in the same voice. I mean, it could potentially make a difference, but we know that in the big picture, just a descending chromatic line. So 3, I think this is becoming 6 in the key of A minor, and this is good because if we look at these passing tones in the upper voices, F, A, D, and B, that is B minor 7 flat 5 over F, which is a passing 2-4-3 chord. Typically 6 does want to go to 2, so it's a good sign that we're seeing a normative progression in a subdivided fashion, and that leads us into our cadence. We get E, A, E, and C natural. That is A minor in 2nd inversion. We would typically expect a 5 chord after this. We have a neighbor tone in the bass here. E, G sharp, E, and B. That is our 5 chord. E major, root position. Little delayed 7th here going on in the alto before we cadence, not on A minor, but A major, which is a choice that Bach makes with some frequency, and it typically ends up being a turnaround back to the key of D minor, because A major is the dominant. He just uses the Picardy 3rd, and it ends up just being kind of a glorified half cadence where we get more than just tonicization of the dominant, we get a modulation to the key of the dominant. But interestingly, it feels like this 1 chord is going to be 5 going to 1. However, we get an interesting progression here. After our A chord, we go to B diminished, B, F, D, and D, F, D, and B. Notice how the lower 3 voices are D minor-like, but it's the B in the melody here that throws us for a loop, right? We would expect this to be a D minor chord, this A to be 5, no problem. And even though our phrase ends in the key of D minor, we're going to be moving in a similar fashion to the second phrase here, to another key. We're going from A to C. And this is why I think the mid-phrase modulation is warranted here because of the symmetry that we have here between the first two phrases and the second two phrases, right? We have a phrase that starts in A minor, continues in A minor just for a little bit, moves to C the same way that the phrase moves to F here, so to the relative major, and then turns back around to D minor at the end of it. So there's some symmetry going on in terms of the choices being made. And we've actually seen this progression somewhat recently. I'm sorry I can't pinpoint the exact chorale. I think if I knew the German better, it would be easier for me to remember the titles, but there was a chorale recently where we had this progression. And I think even though you could start analyzing in the key of C major as early as this B diminished chord, I feel like we're still in the key of A minor through the C major chord. So this presents an example of a modulation zone, or what I've been calling a modulation zone. So sorry, without any further ado, B diminished over D, that is our 2-chord and first inversion. Then we're going to see some adjacent harmony here, C, G, E, and C. So really the big picture is that this 2/6 chord is kind of functioning like the leading tone chord to 3, so it would be like 7 of 3 going to 3, but the chord is diatonic. If you harmonize the scale in this ascending fashion, 1, 2, 3, this is what would happen, right? You would just, by nature of the fact that it is a diminished chord followed by a major chord or a minor chord a half step above it, it's going to feel like it's tonic. So I feel it's a little redundant, but it's important to recognize the relationships of these two chords, because we don't really see 2 to 3 as a chord progression all that often. 2 and 3 don't really get seen adjacently to one another in either direction, really. So this 3 chord is going to be our 1 in the key of C major. Like I said, this is a zone, so you can modulate really at any point between these two beats. And then we go to D, F, D, and B, which is another B diminished chord in first inversion. So we know typically where this would resolve. However, we don't actually resolve there, which is really wild to me. 1, 7, 6, and if I had to bet on what chord would come next, it would be a 1/6 chord, but we don't get a 1/6 chord. We get kind of this passing chord right here, E, G, D, and B, which is a passing 3 chord, more specifically a 3/7 chord, and I feel like that's significant because it is breaking up the 7 chord from the chord that's coming afterwards, which is an F major chord, F, A, C, and A. That's our 4 chord in the key of C major. And the reason why I feel like this is significant is because typically 4 wants to go to 7, and we see 7 go to 4 with some regularity, right? It's transitive, like typically chords follow the cycle of falling fifths, right? In Bach, what we would expect, the majority of the chord progressions we see in Bach are a cycle of falling fifths progressions or adjacent progressions, but when we see chords that go up a fifth, it's unusual, and Bach typically has a reason for it, like there's another approach to the dominant from a different perspective. But when we have this 3 in between the 7 and the 4 chord, 7 wants to go to 3, the same way that 4 wants to go to 7, right? Because it's a fifth below. 7 is a fifth below 4, 3 is a fifth below 7, and then 3 going to 4 is a relatively normative progression. But this 4 chord I think is important because it's our gateway back to the key of D minor. So the key relationships between what's going on in these phrases is the big part, not so much the proportion, because we spend more time in the key of F than we do in the key of C. But the fact that we go from D minor to F back to D, then we go from A to C, and we don't go back to A, we end the phrase in D, but the fact that we experience harmony in relative keys is important, in my opinion. But then we get another chromatic bass line here, E, F, F sharp, and G. And even though we're seeing F sharp here, our general direction is going to be D minor. We know this because of the B flat as well. These passing tones going on here give us a bit of a passing chord that could make a little bit more sense of this progression or add to the progression. So we have, sorry, let me make that look more like a D. If we have F, B flat, D, and A, we saw this chord earlier. It is a 6/7 chord, but more specifically, it is a 6/4/3 chord in the same way that 7 wants to go to 3, 3 wants to go to 6. That same rule of the cycle of falling fifths, something that a lot of the chord progressions in music of this time period abide by. And instead of going to 2, we are moving towards 4 actually, F sharp, A, E flat, and F sharp C, E flat, and A, sorry, is F sharp fully diminished 7th, similar to what we saw here, if I'm not, no, that's G sharp fully diminished 7th, apologies. Still a similar chord in terms of how it functions. It is a fully diminished 7th chord. In this case, it is 7/7 of 4, and that's exactly where it goes to 4, G, B flat, D, and G. This A is a little neighbor tone. This F is a passing tone before we get C sharp, D, E, and E. This, C sharp, B flat, E, and E. We see a similar progression, or not necessarily a progression, but a cadence to what we saw earlier, C sharp, B flat, E, and E, but this B flat is an accented non-chord tone, and just like this situation was also an accented non-chord tone, which makes me feel like this analysis was even more accurate. So this is a 5/6 chord, A major over C sharp, and then we cadence on D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad and root position. Alright, next phrase, we end in a half cadence in the key of D minor again, but just like typical Bach fashion in this chorale, we're going to be moving to another key in the interim, and I believe that key is C major. There might be an argument for the fact that we moved to G major here, but I think it's C major, even though we have this F sharp here. Just the harmony makes a little bit more sense in C major, and the way that everything moves just feels a little bit more C major-like. So we start the phrase off with B, G, D, and B. That's a G major chord. I think I'm going to mark the analysis. Sorry, I wrote D here. What I actually meant to write was C. I think this D minor chord is our 2 chord here. B natural, G, D, and G is our 5 chord in first inversion. Of course, modulation zone. Both of these chords are diatonic to the key of C major, D minor, and G. So if you feel like this G is where we modulate, totally fine. If you feel like this D minor is where we modulate, totally fine. If you feel like the C major is where we modulate, totally fine. I think it's, like I said, a zone, and the process of modulation is fluid. So the E is a non-chord tone, the F is a chordal 7th, but a non-chord tone in this context, and then we resolve the C major, C, C, E, and G. And where maybe there's an argument to be made here that we briefly move to the key of G major, really feels more like a tonicization than anything else. C, F sharp, D, and A is D7 over C, another 4/2 chord. In this case it's 5/4/2 of 5. This A is a chord tone, this G is a non-chord tone, this C is a chord tone, this A is a chord tone. So mostly chord tones in this figure, and if we look at where it resolves to B, D, D, and G, which is 5/6, exactly where we would expect to resolve to. We also have a passing 7th in the melody, and coincidentally, I think this is where we modulate to the key of D minor again. This is now 4/6. This just feels like the perfect place to modulate to D minor because we're going to see ascending melodic minor from this point. It's even started from this A here, and seeing a major 4/6 chord in this configuration is just something that Bach does with a lot of frequency. So C sharp, A, E, and E, that's A major over C sharp, that's 5/6, and we would expect that to go to 1. Which it does, but in typical Bach fashion, we see this D minor with this 9/8 suspension over the alto. Bach does it all the time, this like E being held over in the alto. In this case, he embellishes it a little bit with the C sharp, but we know that the tonic triad is what's being implied here. This E is a passing tone, this C sharp is like a lower enclosure surrounding what is being resolved to. F, A, D, and F is just taking our D minor chord and putting it in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. Then we have another passing tone before we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord in the key of D minor. Alright, looking ahead to our last phrase here, which is also very interesting because I think it ends in a half cadence, but there's an argument to be made that this is an imperfect authentic cadence as well. I think they're both accurate analyses. It really just depends on how you look at the harmony and what you think is really being implied here. I think we move immediately to the key of A minor. Now, the harmony really just spells this out for us. Even though we're getting this tonicization of E here, we see melodic minor happening immediately afterwards. So I think Bach was really setting us up for hearing in this way, because the way that we were seeing A conveyed earlier was with major at the end of the phrase. In fact, every time we've seen A major in a cadential situation, it has always been or every time we've seen A in a cadential situation, it's always been major if it's been the final chord. So we saw it here, we saw it here. And I think actually this is just another instance of mode mixture, and this is just our tonic moving forward. Otherwise, there's a direct modulation to the key of A here. It just really feels strange coming from an A chord and then saying that it's a direct modulation to the key of A. To me, it just feels more, just feels a little bit more genuine and authentic if you view this A as our tonic moving forward. But yes, we're going to start off with some secondary dominants: D sharp, A, F sharp, and B. It's 5, 6, 5 of 5. B is the dominant of E, and E is our dominant in the key of A, and this is a B7 chord over D sharp. We then move to E, G sharp, E, and C. Really interesting chord here. I think there is an argument to be made that I said that this was a 5 chord in my notes, but it's very clearly not a 5 chord. In the same way that this chord right here starts off and feels like it could be a D minor chord, but it isn't. So this is E, G, E, and C is C sharp augmented, which in the key of A is 3 plus 6, and I think you could make an argument also that this is some type of F sharp diminished chord here. So this could be a 6-4-3 chord. We've seen a lot of 4-3 chords in passing as well. Actually, you know what makes more sense is that 3 typically wants to go to 6, and we've seen a lot of 4-3 chords, like I just said, in passing, and that's exactly what's happening here. Sorry for having confused that. I had to it's good that I analyzed the chorale beforehand, because the second take is always better than the first one. But eventually we do resolve where we're supposed to. This sort of feels like a departure from E, 3, 6, and then E, B, G sharp, and B. And sorry for continuing to erase, but I want to make sure that all the chords that happen on the harmonic rhythm are visible, and I could just use an arrow to say that it's happening in passing here. It's actually very possible as well that we're in the key of E. Not without C sharp. Well, I guess it could be, no, it makes a little bit more sense that we're in the key of A minor with the melodic minor going on here. It just feels like that's what's happening. Just an interesting chorale overall. We have this delayed passing seventh as well. This A is a non-chord tone. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we go to A minor, C, C, E, and A. Yeah, it makes more sense that we're in the key of A minor anyways. If we were singing C sharps, I think E would be more sensible, but no, we're definitely in the key of A minor here. Passing tone in the bass, neighbor tone in the tenor, A, C, E, and E. That's just taking our A minor chord and putting it in root position. We then have B, D, E, G, B, E, and E. A little bit of a passing minor dominant action here. Maybe there's a 5-6 going on here as well. It's kind of interesting to see that juxtaposed with all of the G sharps. I'm not sure exactly how important that is here. It's definitely being implied, but with G natural being the case there, I want to make sure that's not a G sharp. No, it is in fact a G natural. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It's a passing chord though, so it's really not as impactful as seeing a chord that stood on its own on the harmonic rhythm. But 3 voices are being used to contribute to it, so maybe there's more to it than meets the eye. But here's what's really interesting. So we know that our final chord is going to be E major, E, B, E, and G sharp, and I do think this is our 5 chord. I am erring on the side of the half cadence being the proper analysis here, but the chords that we use to get there are kind of interesting. We have F sharp, C, E, and A. That would be a 6-7 chord. We've seen a chord like this earlier, if I'm not mistaken. No, the mistake I made is I called this a 6-7 chord in my analysis, in my draft, and it was not a 6-7 chord. That was my bad. This A is a chord tone as well, and then we get B, F sharp, D sharp, and A, which is, like we saw at the beginning of our phrase, another 5-7 of 5 chord. This time it's in root position. This B is an anticipation, but it's also a chord tone, so we don't need to worry about it. And then we cadence on 5. The reason why this cadence looks kind of wonky, 6, 7, 5, 7, and 5, I think this is a half cadence because the G sharp just undoubtedly to me wants to resolve to A, but the F sharp going to B going to E feels like 2, 5, 1 in the key of E. So really in E minor, if we were analyzing this, this would be 2, 7 going to 5, 7 going to 1. If you analyze this as an imperfect authentic cadence, but to me this just undoubtedly sounds like there's tonicization of the dominant going on, and it's a half cadence that's more so on the side of it possibly being an imperfect authentic cadence, but knowing how cadences function at the end of the chorale, I would expect this to be a half cadence just based on my experience, but I could be wrong. You know, this is just the way that I analyze it. I see multiple sides of the picture, and one of the important things about analysis is that if you're unsure about something, maybe it's better to present every side of the perspective instead of doubling down and committing without acknowledging the other side. That's typically what I do. If there's ambivalence in the analysis, I will state every side of the every perspective that I could identify. Maybe there are even more perspectives that I don't identify, but all in all, this is a very fascinating chorale. Chromatic bass line, mid-phrase modulations, this idea of maybe a double leading tone chord here, which is pretty interesting. And also the idea of mode mixture, major tonics popping out all over the place, here, this one basically being a major tonic. It's really interesting the fact that Bach is employing mode mixture this way, and we're also seeing a lot of just use of the melodic minor scale in crafty ways in this chorale, and lots of modulation, but there's all in all, you know, there's some symmetry going on here. D going to F going to D, A going to C going to D. There's a relationship going on here that is definitely carrying across each of the phrases, and it is having an impact on the form. But I think that's all that I want to talk about with this chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to hit the notification icon as well if you're interested in getting my daily upload notification, and also like the video if you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.